Okay, so the recording has started now. Hello, everyone. Good morning. I just want to take 2 minutes of your time to make you understand that we have started with week 6 today. So since week 6, you'll be eligible for an exam voucher. What is the eligibility criteria? What certification are you doing? You need to...
Participants not from google.com domain, but now...
Do you, Marcia?
Sure, thank you. And by the way, yesterday we had already the next session, like 7th meeting with the other group, and there was already a person saying, hey, I applied for a voucher, I took the exam and I passed. So yeah, it's doable. Like, we have the proof now that it's doable. I see people have turned on some AI assistant helping to take notes, and I just noticed that Google Meet now is able to do it as well. So maybe that might be a good idea. It was a internal feature until now, and it wasn't active when there were the participants not from google.com domain, but now I see that it says take your notes with Gemini, and I could click it. So we're definitely going into the right direction. But anyways, welcome everyone. This is our 6th session. There are already some questions. Soumya is answering those, so that's great. Now I shared my screen already, and I am planning to pick up where we left it last week. If you have any questions in the meantime, if you would like me to pick up any other topics, cover something there, if you're struggling with something, then just feel free to let me know. Otherwise, let's just start with cloud logging, because this is, I think, something that we finished with. Let me see. This is, according to my notes, we should start with cloud logging. So instead of going through all those slides here that you already got, let me show you something, right? So basically, well, maybe let's focus on this one first. Basically, Google gives you a lot of logs by default, meaning it wants you to know who did what and when within the platform, right? So some logs like admin activities, like system events, like policies denied, they are logged by or enabled by default. You cannot even disable some of those logs, right? So this is to say that Google prevents some, malicious actors like some rogue admin that will destroy something, and then they would delete the log saying that they destroyed it, right? So that just can be, that just can't happen, right? So this is where you're getting quite a lot of information like out of the box, and obviously some of the other logs you need to enable on top of that. Now, where do the logs go? I think you went through a lab already when you went to Logs Explorer, right? That's the service where you can read all those logs. But what do you think? Where does it take the data from? Like, what are those entries being read from? Like, what is the source? Where do those logs going from storage perspective, right? Where do they land? What do you think? S3, S3 with the AWS probably Google wouldn't redirect the logs to S3, but I understand you may mean like GCS buckets, right? And you're partly right, exactly. You're partly right, because if you go to a service called Log Router, this is something that is there active like by default for every project that you have, right? And by default, when you create a project, you get two so-called, things. This is like the name for log destination, I would say. And you have two of those by default, right? One of those is underscore default, the other one is underscore required. So obviously the required one is exactly for those logs that are enabled by default and cannot be disabled, right? So this is where you just cannot disable that thing, you cannot delete it, you cannot edit it. So this is it, and all the other logs go here, right? And it's all nice. By the way, storage is something called logging bucket. Technically, probably it's some kind of storage, some kind of GCS bucket, right? But it's not the same. Logging bucket, it's not the same as GCS bucket. I don't know what is the difference from technical perspective. I know the difference from pricing perspective, right? So if you go to GCP Cloud Logging Pricing, for example, then, once again, then you will see that cloud logging costs quite a lot. Pricing, let's go to pricing there. So basically, you have logging storage, right? This is actually the logging bucket. This costs you, well, quite a lot, 50 cents a gig, right? So it's pretty sizable. It's really expensive compared to a GCS bucket, right? The GCS bucket starts at about 2 cents a gig, and it can go even lower, right? So this is to say that the default logs that are being ingested are quite expensive. However, you have some free quota, mostly like if you just keep your logs for 30 days, then it's still low, right? But this is to say, if you want to store your logs for longer periods of time, right, you can set it, you can extend those values here, right, those retention like 30 days here. But plus, just be aware that if you would be using those default logging buckets, it would cost you quite a lot. Now, what's the other alternative? The other alternative is you just create additional things, right? So additional like destinations for your logs, right? Now, why would you do it, first of all? What do you think? Why would you create such a sync? Why wouldn't you just be okay with the underscore default one and underscore required one? What is the most common, the most typical use case for having those things created? And maybe even created higher, right? For third-party tool, that's a great answer. Yes, definitely. When you create a sync and you want to redirect those to somewhere else, like you are not fine with just using Logs Explorer, but kind of third-party CM tool, then definitely you would redirect those logs. Somewhere else. The other use case, very common one, and this is what we will going to see now, is you would like to centralize the logs, right? do you think? Why is that, right? Why would you like to create a sync, not on a project level, but you would like to do some kind of a sync on a global level? What would be the advantage there, right? Think about like, having multiple projects. If you have 129 projects and you want to analyze those logs, well, what do you need to do? You need to switch between all those projects, right? Is it really a very optimal approach? Is it like, from time perspective and cost perspective, etc.? Probably not, right? So the best practice is actually to go much higher, right? And this is where I went to my org level. I still have those underscore default and underscore required logs, okay? They are there not only for projects, but also for folders and for the organization, as you can see. And what I can do now is I can create a sync and I can say, maybe that will be a global sync audit logs, for example, right? And what we can do, we will talk about sync destinations in a minute, but what we can do is just choose those logging buckets, those expensive ones, right? And then let's see the other options. The rest of the options are actually about what you want to include in the logs, in that sync, and what you want to exclude, right? Because even with that third-party CM tool or any other reason to redirect logs somewhere else, you would really want you would want to filter them, right? So you would like to say, hey, I am interested only in logs that contain errors, right? Or my interest is GKE logs, please redirect them here and there, right? So this is not about just following or redirecting all of the platform logs somewhere, but being very cautious and concrete when it comes to what logs you want to redirect. There is some kind of specific pattern there, some kind of language, I would say, right? Where you need to create those filters. We will not learn how to do it. Probably you might, I'm not even sure if you will practice it during the during the labs. I don't think you should get any specific questions on those on the exam, right? If you are aware that those filters are there, that should be probably enough, right? But what I wanted also to say is, or to show you that by default, when you're creating that log on some higher level, this sync will be for that level. But look at this one, right? This is actually the best practice. You would create a sync on an org level, and you would say all the logs of its children as well, right? So all the folders and all the products underneath will also be redirected. Those logs will be redirected. So this is exactly about centralization. This is about you, security personnel, having a kind of a sync that propagates down, that moves all those audit logs, all those wordings, errors, etc., to a central destination, right? And now let's see what that central destination would be. This is where you have quite a bit of choice, right? So as we mentioned, by default, you would have those logging buckets, which are not very cost optimal, as we have said, but you have also some other resources, right? BigQuery dataset, already much better, especially if you want to analyze those logs with SQL, right? And cloud storage buckets, right? So this is the separation, right? Logging bucket is probably also dependent on this one, but it's like 25 or more times more expensive, right? So you can choose that cloud storage bucket, or just like we already mentioned, if you want to integrate with some third-party tool that will analyze those logs and give you some recommendations, you can also redirect those logs to a subtopic, right? And for all of those options, as you can see, you point to the project, right? What that means is, although the configuration here is on the organization node, the destination itself, the storage itself, the data set, right, or the bucket or the subtopic will not be defined here on the organization, but it will be really defined or created in a separate project. That would be a central project for your logging, right? So that's the best practice. Create that sync on a high level, redirect all the important logs to some specific project, and then you don't have to switch through all those tens or hundreds of projects that you have, but you can focus on a single one, right? So this is what I wanted you to know. And the other thing is data access logs. That's also something that would be useful for the exam, right? So let's now go back to the project. And if we now go to audit logs, right, what we would see is the list of all the services or all the APIs, right? So let's choose one of those, right? Maybe let's choose Cloud SQL, right? So this is where we see what is being logged for that service now. And what this shows us is that admin write actions are being logged, right? We don't even see it on the list. Admin write means that all the changes to that and all the other APIs are actually logged by default, and you get that information, right? This is due to what I already said at the beginning. Google wants you to know what is happening within your platform, who is changing what and when, right? So you can increase the logging level, as you can see, with choosing some of those options. You can opt in and you can say, hey, I don't need only admin write, but I also want logs to be generated if someone reads metadata or configuration of that service. I can go even further. I can say, I am also interested in logging when someone reads or writes data to that service, right? And this is really interesting. You can really have an audit log whenever someone fetches the data from your service. As you can imagine, it can produce a ton of logs, so you have to be careful with that. But maybe this is some very special use case. Maybe you have some very sensitive information there. Maybe you need the data. And also you can filter out some of the data, right? So maybe you are saying, hey, I want to have information when someone fetches the data, but only if they do it like directly. If someone connects directly to my Cloud SQL instance, but if it's an application user that fetches the data, then I'm okay with that because I know what the application can do, right? So I only want to be notified if someone redirects or connects directly. So this is where I can go to those exempted principles and I can say, hey, that user, I'm not interested in that one, right? Meaning this is my application user maybe, and I don't want to have terabytes of logs generated just because users are writing or using the application. I am just interested in admin logging directly to the database and fetching some data, right? This is what I want to be alerted on. Okay, so I guess those were the most important things when it comes to logging. Okay, and let's try to answer that question already. This is actually about those audit logs or data access logs, right? So this is exactly about those settings, data read, data write. Let me. So how we would use cloud audit logs to enable such an analysis, right? On someone accessing your cloud storage and BigQuery. What are your thoughts here? What would you choose? We know that it's about data access logs, right? This is about that specific UI. So we would enable some of those: data read, maybe admin read, data read, and data write. Those are the three things that we see in the UI, right? So what option would you choose here? Let's wait for some answers there. Okay, so I see. Whoa, we have Bs and Cs and even Ds. So we have quite a lot of different options there. So first of all, let's see if we can enable it on the org level, right? So yes, we can, just like for the project level, right? So maybe it should be B, right? But what's wrong with B? And well, basically this is a tricky thing. This is why we are going through those questions to learn. Why is it C? This is C for one reason only. BigQuery is special. You may have not heard about it, but this is why we are here. If we go to those audit logs and if we look for BigQuery, we will not find it, right? It's like BigQuery is an analytics hub, data policy, migration API, but we don't see BigQuery, just like we see cloud storage, right? Or we can see Cloud SQL or all those data services. BigQuery is simply not there. Why is it the case? This is just because Google did something strange. This is the line, right? And they said BigQuery logs for data access are enabled by default and you cannot even disable those, right? So my understanding of that behavior is that BigQuery can cost quite a bit, right? If someone fetches or someone executes a SQL command that fetches a lot of data that is not very optimal, etc., it can generate quite a lot of costs. This is why you may want to find out who ran that query, who fetched that data, etc., right? So this is why BigQuery was treated as a kind of an exception. And please just remember for the exam that data access logs for BigQuery are just enabled by default. For all the others, you have to actually explicitly enable them if you want to have it, right? And obviously you can do it on different levels. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Just remember that BigQuery is special. Let's move forward with the last topic of last week. And this is where I want to say a couple of things about shared VPCs and VPC peering. Why that is? Because I don't want to explain those services in details. You have learned about it. Hopefully you understand those. But what I'm seeing quite often is that people mix them a little bit, right? People tend to think that it's either shared VPCs that you will be using or VPC network peering. It's one or the other, right? And this slide actually tells you that it is not really one or the other, right? Those services are for different use cases. They're on different levels, I would say, right? First, when you are creating your network setup within GCP, you have to make some decisions how your networking would look like, right? How many VPCs would you have? Would you be using standalone VPCs or shared VPCs, right? And here is where we have a standalone VPC here on the right, and we have a shared VPC on the left, okay? With a host project where all the networking resources are located, and with service projects, we just consume those, right? But that's just a decision how you want to set up your networking structure, right? In most cases, shared VPCs would be the best practice, but not everywhere, but in most cases, yes. Now, after you are done with defining how many and what type of VPCs would you have, and you might say, okay, I will have 3 VPCs, maybe all of them would be shared. One would be for productive workloads, one for non-prods, one kind of shared VPC or DMZ kind of VPC or whatever, right? So you are there with a decision that you would have 3 VPCs, right? Now, the second decision that you need to make is if and how would you connect those VPCs together, right? Because maybe you don't want to have the visibility, the internal visibility, right, between prods and non-prods. Maybe that's like by design, right? But maybe you do. And if you do, if you want to connect your VPCs together, then regardless if those VPCs are shared VPCs or they are standalone VPCs, you can connect them with a number of ways. The first option, the most common one, I would say, is actually VPC network peering, right? So VPC network peering just peers, just connects two networks together, regardless if those networks are shared VPCs or standalone VPCs. We could have two shared VPCs on both sides. We could have two standard VPCs on both sides, etc. Right? So in many cases, you would use both concepts, shared VPCs and VPC network peering, right? And here's a table where the use cases are specific, right? Shared VPC is about centralization within a single organization of yours, while VPC network peering is just for connectivity. It doesn't centralize anything. It can connect VPCs even across organizations, right? That's the idea. If you still have some queries, issues with that, feel free to ask. And also read a little bit about it, maybe perform a lab or two. There are definitely labs about those, but you need to differentiate between those. That's for sure, right? And about the idea, right? Those networks are shared VPCs or standalone VPCs with a decision, one kind of shared VPC or DMZ kind of VPC or whatever, right? So you are there with a decision that you would have three VPCs, right? Now the second decision that you need to make is if and how would you connect those VPCs together? VPCs where all the networking resources are located, and the VPCs when you are there, shared VPC that you will be using, or VPC network peering. It's one or the other, right? And this slide actually tells you that it is not really one or the other, right? Those services are for different use cases. They're on different levels, I would say, right? First, when you are creating your network setup within GCP, you have to make some decisions how your networking would look like, right? How many VPCs would you have? Would you be using standalone VPCs or shared VPCs, right? And here is where we have a standalone VPC here on the right, and we have a shared VPC on the left, okay? With a host project where all the networking resources are located, and with service projects, we just consume those, right? But that's just a decision how you want to set up your networking structure, right? In most cases, shared VPCs would be the best practice, but not everywhere, but in most cases, yes. Now, after you are done with defining how many and what type of VPCs would you have, and you might say, okay, I will have 3 VPCs, maybe all of them would be shared. One would be for productive workloads, one for non-prods, one kind of shared VPC or DMZ kind of VPC or whatever, right? So you are there with a decision that you would have 3 VPCs, right? Now, the second decision that you need to make is if and how would you connect those VPCs together, right? Because maybe you don't want to have the visibility, the internal visibility, right, between prods and non-prods. Maybe that's like by design, right? But maybe you do. And if you do, if you want to connect your VPCs together, then regardless if those VPCs are shared VPCs or they are standalone VPCs, you can connect them with a number of ways. The first option, the most common one, I would say, is actually VPC network peering, right? So VPC network peering. Peering just peers, just connects two networks together, regardless if those networks are shared VPCs or standalone VPCs. We could have two shared VPCs on both sides. We could have two standard VPCs on both sides, etc. Right? So in many cases, you would use both concepts, shared VPCs and VPC network peering, right? And here is a table where the use cases are specific, right? Shared VPC is about centralization within a single organization of yours, while VPC network peering is just for connectivity. It doesn't centralize anything. It can connect VPCs even across organizations, right? That's the idea. If you still have some queries, issues with that, feel free to ask. And also read a little bit about it, maybe perform a lab or two. There are definitely labs about those, but you need to differentiate between those. That's for sure, right? And yeah, maybe before we wrap up that session of ours, the last one, the previous one, let's still try. To answer one of the questions, which actually expects that you understand those concepts, right? Both VPC network peering and shared VPC. Okay, I will now let you go through this one. See audit logs. It's about auditing. accessing the data, etc., or the changes. So it's not what we are looking for. SSHing and using ping, probably not the very optimal way to troubleshoot. And exactly now we need to choose between T and D. So Mohan says C. Hopefully we all agree. VPC flow logs, remember that those are like only a fraction of logs that are out there of what's happening within your network. So they are not very specific to troubleshoot connectivity tests. This is why we have those connectivity tests there, right? I think we have seen them, connectivity tests. So this is where are those? So this is the part of that network intelligence center. This is where you can say, hey, I want to create a connectivity test between a source and a target, and I'm using that kind of a protocol. The source and the target may be within GCP, maybe outside of GCP, and so on and so forth. So a lot of options here. And as you see, I have been using it quite extensively, right? And then I can see all the results, right? I can see the packet leaving the VM using the default egress firewall rule, being routed to another subnet, right? And then when it reaches the traffic reaches the target instance, the default ingress firewall rule blocked it, right? So this is where I know why the connectivity fails, right? So very, very useful tool, by the way. Okay, let's move forward. But let's start from a quiz for this week. Let's try to answer a couple of questions. This one may be interesting. Probably thinking between VPC flow logs or packet mirroring. Those would be the most interesting choices, I guess, right? Because to explore network flows and the payloads, to investigate something, well, VPC service controls is rather to constrain, right, exfiltration data, so it's not this use case. Marketplace IDS, well, intrusion detection system is not necessarily the tool, and I don't know of anything called, or maybe it's there, like deep packet inspection of Cloud Armor. At least I'm not aware of that service. So basically, let's unpack that. So what happens is that you currently monitor and detect network anomalies somewhere, right, based on packet header information. So most probably you are already doing some analysis and seeing that something is wrong here and there, right? In that subnet, in a specific VM, you see that some kind of traffic seems out of standard, right? Something unusual is happening. And I agree, this is where VPC flow logs would be probably used to give you that information, right? But you want more now. You want something to hunt. You want something to take those insights from VPC flow logs, and you want to explore concrete network flows. You want to explore concrete anomalies to hunt and to see what's going on. And this is actually when you would need something more, and this is where packet mirroring would be really useful. Let's have a look at this one, because Ashish says it's there. So interesting. I wasn't aware of that. Deep packet inspection on ingress traffic. Okay. I'm not sure what it does, so I will need to educate myself a little bit, but thanks for letting me know, right? Okay, now going back to that question, let's go and have a look, because actually we have the packet mirroring for this week. We have a couple of slides about it, about both packet mirroring and cloud IDS, right? So let's go to mirroring, right? And as you can see, it's like another policy. So we have a ton of policies here in Google. So what I want to show you is that in on-premises, you might have an approach where you might deploy something centrally, like some Palo Alto, some F5 appliances or anything like that, right? You deploy it somewhere near your routers because your routers in on-premises are data plane devices, so all the traffic is going through those. So it's relatively easy to plug in such an appliance, and you would be able to inspect all the traffic within your whole network, right? And you can analyze it, you can make some additional firewall decisions based on that, etc. This is not how you would do it in GCP, right? Although some customers would like or would love to deploy their F5s to Google's data centers, probably Google does not agree on that kind of behavior, right? So this is exactly what you would do in Google. You would first have some insights and some recommendations on a high level, telling you, hey, here some anomaly starts to happen, here is where you should dive deeper and analyze it a little bit more. And only then you turn on some specific logs, like those packet mirroring logs, which are turned on not for the whole network like you would do in on-premises, but they are turned on very selectively. Like you see here, we need to choose a region, we need to choose a VPC that is of our interest, and also we would narrow it down even further, right? We would say, hey, I have noticed that that weird behavior is happening within my specific network or within instances that have specific network tag. Or you could even choose specific instances, specific VMs, right? And only then, when you narrow it down to the VMs that are of your interest, you would enable that kind of a policy, right? So very selective and also time-based. It's not like on-premises where all the traffic is being analyzed all the time. This is where it is more selective here, right? So that's where the differences come from. And this is where packet mirroring plays its role to generate those logs based on what's happening on a specific VM or set of VMs. And now the question is, what's then, right? Because we already know that packet mirroring is the right answer here to explore the flows and the payload, etc. But now the question remains, and this is where we are left here with no continuation, but what happens afterwards? After we turn on that packet mirroring, how do we even go about that kind of analysis? What tool do we use for that analysis? And obviously, there is a lot of third-party tools that we could use, but I wanted you to show you or to tell you that Google recently launched their Cloud IDS, right? IDS stands for Intrusion Detection System. Until recently, there was no IDS system within Google. At the moment, I think it's right, that kind of analysis. What tool do we use for that analysis? And obviously, there is a lot of third-party tools that we could use, but I wanted you to show you or to tell you that Google recently launched their Cloud IDS, right? IDS stands for Intrusion Detection System. Until recently, there was no IDS system within Google. At the moment, I think we still don't have IPS system, right? Intrusion Detection System. Maybe Cloud Armor is to some extent, but there isn't a specific IDS system. So just keep in mind that Cloud IDS is now there. Google is saying that this is their cloud native IDS system. To be honest, if you see the picture, this is really Palo Alto underneath the hood, right? So that Palo Alto takes that mirror traffic that packet mirroring generates, it analyzes the traffic and it gives you some insights and it pushes that to either Cloud Logging or Security Command Center or Chronicle, right? So this is like two-step setup, first packet mirroring, and then you decide what kind of tool you want to use. And just be mindful that it is not very cloud native tool, right? Regardless of what Google is saying, that Cloud IDS is theirs. Cloud native tool, while Palo Alto is still somewhere there underneath, right? Okay, so another thing. Thing that you need to know about it actually. Where were we? Yeah. So this is one of the most common questions about packet mirroring. Let's first try to address it. Exactly. We have two answers. Both are true. So just be aware that you need a policy, just like we followed or we started to create a policy here. But as you can see, when you would go to the next step and we need to select something called collector destination, right? So those destinations are actually some VMs or some groups of VMs, right? Because the idea behind packet mirroring is quite interesting. Normally you would have a VM and all the traffic would be redirected to that VM, right? Now Google, if you create such a policy, Google is creating a pass-through load balancer, right? Before that VM, right? And all that traffic, it adjusts the routing in some specific way. And all that traffic that would normally go straight to that VM first goes to that load balancer, and that load balancer mirrors the traffic, as the name of the suggests, right? Packet mirroring. The load balancer mirrors the traffic to both the instance where it should go and to the collector instance. And this is in order not to slow down the real time processing, I would say. And this is to have that collector instance with all those logs to be analyzed by Cloud IDS or any other service, right? So just remember that it's not enough to have a policy. There is still a load balancer and some collector instances, right? So yeah, great. Now, let's go back to the very beginning of today's slides, and that's where we shall talk about a couple of things. We will mostly focus on compliance today, right? So that should be a pretty interesting thing. When it comes to compliance, Google obviously wants to be compliant against everything out there, right? So if you go to cloud.google.com/compliance, you will see something called Compliance Resource Center, and Google is saying, hey, we are compliant against like tens and hundreds of different certifications and offerings there that are specific to the region, right? You can go into every one of those, like, I don't know, let's maybe go to GDPR, right? I'm located in Europe, so this one is like one of the most obvious ones for me. And regardless where you go, which one you choose, Google explains what that regulation is about, how does it kind of play along with Google Cloud Platform, what services you can use, which you can't use, how you should configure them, and so on and so forth, right? So a lot of information about every compliance out there. And Google is doing its best to be compliant against all of those, and they are going through regular audits that confirm that Google is compliant against this and that, right? Now, what do you think about your workloads, right? You deploy something to GCP, right? You create a system, you use some services. Now, how does it map to that compliance? Is it simply that your systems are compliant against those as well, because Google is? Are they not? Do you need to do something to be compliant? Do you need to go through an audit? Or what do you think about it, right? What do you think happens where you deploy resources to GCP and you want to be compliant against some specific regulation out there? And let's say that it's, I don't know, HIPAA and Google is compliant. Thank you, Ashish. That's the key statement, like shared responsibility model. Let's have a look at the slide there. Yes, this is the one, right? What is shared responsibility model? Well, as the name suggests is that some of the responsibility is on your end and some is on Google's end. Obviously, if you're running it on premises, everything is your responsibility. And then the more advanced cloud services you are using, the more responsibilities you offload to Google. But still, even if you use something very advanced, like all those serverless platforms, you are still responsible about how you use the platform, about the data that you put in, about how you secure it, and so on and so forth, right? So for example, when it comes to GDPR, right? And maybe let's say that very short explanation would be that your data should stay within Europe, right? Now, it is really easy to think of a way to go against it, right? If an employee of yours creates a GCS bucket, for example, in the United States and uploads some sensitive data there, well, you are not GDPR compliant anymore, right? What would you do? What would be your choice to make sure that you are GDPR compliant regarding your data location? Like if the question asks you, right? Your customer needs to be GDPR compliant. They need to make sure that your data stays within Europe. What do you think? How would you translate it to Google's services, to the options that you have, to the security mechanisms that you know of? Use org policy to enforce bucket creation in Europe region. I would even say use org policy to make sure that all your resources are created in a specific region, right? GCP org policy is location, restricting resource locations, right? This is a org policy where you can specify that if anyone would actually be creating any GCP resource, including GCS buckets, but also anything else, this is where you can deny or allow different values, and you can say, hey, anything that gets created needs to be there in some specific region, right? So this is how you would translate that compliance requirements to the actual solution. This is your choice, right? This is why you are not automatically compliant with everything, because you have to deliver some things in a specific manner. You have to use Google's best practices and tools. And if you don't, well, you are not compliant in most cases, right? Unless you follow a different approach, right? So this one is the basic one, is the most common one. But Google is also trying to do something else here. Some customers are a bit afraid of moving to the public cloud because they're saying, okay, we are fine with on-premises. We know how it works here. We are going through different audits. We are a bit afraid of what happens once we go to the cloud, right? We are not sure how to make sure that we would still be compliant against this and that, right? So this is where Google is saying, you can follow the shared responsibility approach, which is a standard one. But if you are really unsure about it, if you want our help here, then we can offer you to move from shared responsibilities to something called shared fate, right? And this is where Google is saying, hey, we have the same fate, we and the customer, and that's why we have released a service called Assured Workloads, right? So that's a service that is a part of compliance offering that, just like most of those security-related ones, would have to be set up on the org level, right? And what you would do here is you can create folders. Now, why would you even create folders? This is because in most cases, your whole organization does not be, even if your organization needs to be compliant against some specific regulation, it usually means that only some systems within that organization need to be compliant, right? You would be storing some sensitive information in selected systems. And this is where you would probably isolate those systems, into folders, right? And you would say, hey, this is where I'm keeping my sensitive information. This is where I need to be compliant against some specific regulation, but it doesn't have to mean that my whole organization and all the projects and all the resources need to be compliant. So this is why in assured workloads, you would create so-called folders, right? And you would say, this is my folder one. I want to create it somewhere. And now I would choose so-called control package. And there are different options there, but basically this is exactly where you would choose a specific central compliance regulation that you want to follow, right? So maybe you need to be HIPAA compliant, right? So we would create a folder. You would say this folder needs to be HIPAA compliant, and it will be somewhere within the US, obviously, because HIPAA is for US. And basically this is where Google might restrict you from doing something wrong here. So Google will ensure that whenever you create something within that folder, it follows HIPAA requirements, right? This is the idea behind assured workloads. For the exam, you don't need to know the details about those. Just know that this is a new approach or the alternative approach according to shared fate. If the customers do not want to do everything on their own, but they want some assurance from Google regarding compliance, you have that kind of service, right? So it's kind of an alternative out there. And let's still go back a little bit. So we're talking about compliance, right? You should mostly focus on security services. You should focus on how to translate compliance requirements to specific GCP technical resources, solutions, and options, right? Just like we have asked you. What would you do if you would need to be GDPR compliant? You said, hey, we need to use our policy to enforce some restriction on the locations, right? This is what you should focus on. This is what you have been learning about for the last weeks, right? You learned about all those shielded VMs, shared VPCs, Cloud Armor, Cloud VPN, and so on and so forth. But you still should know just a little bit about those regulations, right? So this is why I'm giving away also 2 slides here with 7 different regulations explained on a very high level. It's probably beneficial if you know what they do, what they are about. No details here, but just have a rough understanding. Like, HIPAA is healthcare related, like FIPS 140 is for some kind of federal agencies. It is about using cryptographic models, including hardware. I have seen some tricky questions, right? Some of the questions will be clear, like they would say you need to be GDPR compliant, and they will explain, hey, what do you do in order to stay within a specific location? But some may be a little bit tricky. Like I've seen a question about FIPS 140, right? And it asked me, how do you make sure that you fulfill FIPS 140/2, right? And there were a couple of answers, and I was able to choose HSM, that hardware security module that we talked about, just because I knew on the high level what FIPS 140 was about, right? So don't focus heavily on those compliance regulations, but like if you know what's happening on those 2 slides, probably it's enough, and focus on those, right? On security measures in GCP to fulfill those regulations, okay? So hopefully that makes sense. And what I would like us to do now actually is to move forward to a brainstorming exercise, right? So let's try to practice. Let's try to have a look at PCI DSS, right? So one of the most common compliance regulations out there. It has a number of requirements. Those requirements are not really GCP specific, right? Those requirements is something you need to fulfill when your company is handling financial transactions. They are, you are storing credit card information and so on and so forth. And it doesn't really matter if you're running your workloads in GCP or AWS or on-premises on your laptop. You have to fulfill those, right? So let's try to have a look at those 7 or 8 requirements of PCI DSS, and let's try to map them to specific solutions within Google, right? Let's think about how to translate them to technical aspects. That's the first one. Seems obvious, I think, right? So what would you think about it? How would you implement that requirement in GCP? What would you do? You would use a service called, right? It asks you to do what? Install and maintain a firewall configuration to protect some kind of data. So you would use what service within GCP? Cloud Armor's firewall rules. Firewall rules are actually the most obvious answer, but probably it may be a bit more than that, right? So firewall rules are there to define, we always have some source and target with firewall rule, right? So first of all, before we even define firewall rules, probably we would need to do what we already mentioned. We would need to isolate the systems that would be in scope of PCI DSS. We would deploy them to a specific project or a folder and maybe a separate VPC there, right? And we would then have everything else somewhere else, right? So we would like isolate those resources that are in scope for PCI DSS, and only then we would think, okay, now would those VPCs needs to talk to each other? If yes, we resource PCI DSS. We always have some source and target with firewall rule, right? So first of all, before we even define firewall rules, probably we would need to do what we already mentioned. We would need to isolate the systems that would be in scope of PCI DSS. We would deploy them to a specific project or a folder and maybe a separate VPC there, right? And we would then have everything else somewhere else, right? So we would like isolate those resources that are in scope for PCI DSS, and only then we would think, okay, now would those VPCs need to talk to each other? If yes, we might peer them, and then we might define those firewall rules, right? Perimeter firewall rules. So basically, maybe VPC service controls might also be applicable here, right? There are kind of firewall rules for your data, right? In order to say, hey, this is my perimeter. Those projects within that or the services within that VPC are within perimeter. This is where my sensitive data is, and I don't allow exfiltration of that, right? Those would be services that you would think about. Requirement number 2 says, do not use vendor supplied defaults. So let's try to define those. What kind of defaults do you know that Google gives you that are not necessarily best practices from security perspective, right? They give those defaults to you because they want you to start quickly and easily and not to struggle, but they are not really great. What defaults are those? What do you think? What kind of defaults do you get in GCP? Default networks, great. Following on that, with default networks, you first get default subnets in all of the regions with the same CIDR ranges every time, which is crazy. And you get default firewall rules because Google wants you to, when you create a VM, Google wants you to easily SSH into that VM. They don't want you to struggle and say, okay, I have created a VM, I cannot now SSH to that one, I move to a different cloud provider, Google sucks, right? They don't want you to get that feeling. So they are giving you default firewall rules so that you can log in from the internet to your VMs, right? Is it a secure approach? Well, definitely not, right? So the solution is just to skip the default network creation. There is an org policy for that, right? You will then not have default networks, you will not have default firewall rules, you will not have default subnets. Okay, what other defaults do we have? Those are not the end, right? What other defaults do you know of that you get with GCP? IAM roles, great, like maybe those basic IAM roles, which shouldn't be used, maybe even some predefined roles, right? They might be too broad. What else do you get? Default logging, of course. This doesn't have to be bad, but it just may not be enough, right? Those default logging settings might not give you enough insights. When you are creating a VM, what do you think about defaults there? Do you see some others? Thank you. Service accounts, obviously, right? So when you create a VM, you are automatically suggested that you should use a default service account, right? Shouldn't be the case. You shouldn't use it. Default images, right? When you create a VM, and this is actually what the slide shows you, but this is not like the right answer and yours weren't right. It's like one of the answers only, right? So those default operating systems, those public operating systems that we talked about last week, those are also considered defaults, right? So you might not want to use those, right? So yeah, great job. Now, the third one, how would you protect stored cardholder data? So in other words, how do you protect data that is sensitive, right? Your credit card information of your customers. Exactly, that would be mostly, well, don't store it. That's one choice, right? That's not anything that we should laugh about. It should be your conscious choice if you want to store sensitive data within your systems. And if so, then are your services prepared to store those systems, right? A very valid point, right? Now, how do you protect? Mostly, this is exactly about encryption, right? So GMAC, CMAC, CSEC, HSM, external key managers, and so on and so forth. Everything that we have learned about. Those are your options, but even if you do nothing, you are still protected by encryption, right? Someone said DLT, right, Nitin, and this is actually a very nice idea. This actually kind of goes back to this one, right? If we have isolated those systems here, and let's say that here we have some sensitive information, and now that information is about transactions, our customers, etc. And now we want to analyze that information using BigQuery, for example, right? Now, do we really need those sensitive information to analyze it? Do we need specific credit card numbers? Do we need specific addresses, etc.? Probably not, right? Probably we can abstract some of those information and still do a meaningful analysis, right? So that means that maybe this is our transactional system with sensitive information. Here we would have our BigQuery data set, and now we would use DLP to move that information from source to target, right, using that connection, but with DLP, with a step that makes the data, that anonymizes the data, right, that goes from data containing sensitive information to having a BigQuery data set without that specific information, which is still useful in many cases, right? Okay, good job. Now the fourth one says you need to encrypt, basically encrypt data in transit, right, across open public networks. Now, what are your ideas about this one? Right, just like we were talking about encrypting data at rest, this is about encrypting data in transit. Yes, Cloud Interconnect, Cloud VPN. So basically, this is about having some private or at least encrypted tunnel for the connectivity. But if we are asking about transmission over public network, this is also about the end customers, right? So this is where we would be saying, hey, expose your workloads via load balancers. Those load balancers will be layer 7 HTTPS load balancers with managed SSL certificates. Use HTTPS, maybe also use some service meshes if you want to do MTLS between different VMs or microservices, right? So a bit of your responsibility as a Google customer, but basically Google also gives you a default protection about that kind of traffic, right? So you can also Google about data GCP encryption in transit, right? There is a whole document that talks about this specific thing and how Google thinks about encrypting your data in transit, right? Okay, a couple of more. I think we got the idea. This one is pretty tricky, like, protect against malware and regularly update antivirus software. So it depends on your use case, really. It kind of assumes that you are using VMs, but you don't have to use VMs, so there are different ways to do it. What the screenshot or what the slide is saying is that maybe Security Command Center would help us with that, would point out those topics, would say, hey, please update this and that because you're vulnerable against something, right? That might be one of the ideas. This one is also very, very broad, right? And you see how not concrete those some of those requirements are. What does it even mean? Like develop and maintain secure systems and applications. We could think about what CI/CD systems, right? With all those vulnerability scanning, binary authorization, and so on, not storing your secrets in the source code. I think the slide says about managing your operating system versions if you're using VMs. Probably you could think of